Welcome to the Proceedings Podcast. I'm Bill Hamblet, the editor-in-chief of Proceedings at the U.S. Naval Institute. Today is Tuesday, October 11th, 2022. In the news this week, on Saturday, 8 October, a massive explosion ripped through the Crimean Bridge over the Kerch Strait, connecting Crimea with mainland Russia, damaging a major line of communication and logistics supply for the Russian military. And yesterday, 10 October, saw widespread Russian military attacks on cities throughout Ukraine. I've seen a lively debate on Twitter about whether or not the bridge was a valid military target or if attacking it was an act of terrorism by the Ukrainians. My JAG friends assure me bridges are valid military targets according to the law of armed conflict. And as a former targeteer, I did target a lot of bridges during my career. So definitely a valid military target to hit a bridge. Last Friday, I highlighted several articles from the October issue of Proceedings. I did not talk much about this month's American Sea Power Project article because my guests today are the authors of that article. Joining me from Northern Virginia are Trent and from Southern Maryland, Navy Lieutenant Eric Vorm. They are the authors of Intellectual Readiness Is Vital to Sea Power, which appears on pages 50 to 57 of the October issue. If you have the print magazine, or you can find it online. Trent, Eric, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Bill. Very happy to be here.
Yep. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Let me read your bios quickly, just so our listeners are familiar with you. Trent is an authority on the U.S. Navy of the early 20th century and a leader in the application of complexity science to organizational design. He's a consultant to a variety of organizations on processes and techniques, and writes and speaks about leadership, sense-making, organizational learning, and complexity. And he's the author of one of my favorite books, Learning War, The Evolution of Fighting Doctrine in the U.S. Navy, 1898 to 1945, which was published by the Naval Institute Press 4 years ago. And his newest book, which I can't wait to read, is called Mastering the Art of Command, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz and Victory in the Pacific, which is brand new from the Naval Institute Press as well. Trent, great to have you on the show again. And Eric Vorm, Lieutenant Vorm, is a medical service corps officer and aerospace experimental psychologist with the Naval Air Systems Command. He conducts research in human-machine teaming, human anatomy interaction, and human systems integration. His PhD is in human-computer interaction from Indiana University. He served with the U.S. Marine Corps during Operation Iraqi Freedom and is a member of the IEEE Robotics and Automation and Systems Man and Cybernetics Societies. Wow, that's a mouthful. Eric, great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me, Bill.
All right, I want to start off. Your article says, it starts by saying the intellect of naval leaders, including their education and mental agility, is vital to wartime readiness. So I'll go to Trent first, but I just want you two to discuss that concept.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Part of the charter here for this article, as you mentioned, it's part of the American Sea Power Project. And the focus that I was initially given when we were talking about an article was talking about the kinds of mental preparation that would be necessary for the Navy and for its sister services to prepare adequately and succeed in time of war. And so that was the charter. And I looked at it a little broadly. I had some ideas of how to bring these together. And one of those ideas was a recent conversation that I had with Eric, who ended up being a co-author, and the study that he was engaged in to look at intellectual readiness, to understand how the Navy could better prepare, not just for combat, but especially how to bring in innovative technologies and new ways of bringing to bear innovative ideas for the success of the service. And I thought that would be a nice theme to draw out. So in some early drafts, I put that together and shared it with Eric to make sure that I wasn't misrepresenting any of his ideas or his perspective. He got back to me with a lot of really valuable feedback, and it worked out that we decided to co-author it. So vital to wartime readiness. I think so. This is a theme that I really wanted to draw out because there are uncertainties that are going to happen in any kind of a conflict. You just mentioned the bridge attack in Crimea, and I that was a surprise to me. I didn't expect to wake up Saturday morning, see that on Twitter, like you did, like so many others did. And there's got to be an ability to be ready for those things that are not just surprising, but also really undermine our assumptions about how things are going to play out, about how we're going to work together, about how a peer competitor is going to behave and perform. And I think one of the things that Eric and I tried to speak to was the kind of preparation that is necessary mentally, intellectually, to deal with that.
So, Eric, same question to you, but now that I know that you were working on a study, I'm curious, was that study one that was undertaken on your own volition, or was it something that the Navy had asked you to study?
Yeah, great question. So I was approached in very early 2021 or very late 2020 by representatives from the OPNAV N1, which is Manpower, Personnel, and Training and Education, which, to folks who are not, that familiar with the Navy's structures, you can just think of it as the Navy's Human Resources Department. They make all the policies, and they have a large role to play in virtually everything having to do with people, how they're brought into the Navy, how they're trained and prepared for specific jobs, how they're promoted, all sorts of different things. And the impetus for this study was that there's a growing, say, cause of concern that we have taken our love of technology and our trust of technology as a determinant for victory in a kinetic fight a little bit too far. And the overemphasis on technology development kind of leaves a lot of potential vulnerabilities. Some may actually put it in a different way, just to say, which one wins wars, better technology or better people? And there's debate within that. So this group of people approached me and said, we really want to figure out, and wrap our heads around what is this concept of intellectual readiness. We have other forms of readiness that many of our listeners probably are aware of, like we have physical readiness. We have to do our physical fitness test every, twice a year. And we have medical readiness where we get immunizations. And so our sailors and Marines are always prepared to deploy anywhere around the world within a very short period of time. We have material readiness. The ships that we have to remain in a certain condition of material readiness so that we can just pull up anchor and take off if we need to. So what's the equivalent for our people? And within that, there's also some underlying tensions that training can very easily, through no fault of any specific organization, but training can very easily become a crutch. And the way that you train people can become sort of this rote memorization rather than, say, training people to think creatively or to respond creatively when presented with new problems they've never seen before. And so those were the motivations behind the study that I ran. And I ran that study through all of 2021 and it formally concluded in June of this year, 2022. And Trent just happened to be one of the people that I called up because I had read his book, Learning War, and also because I knew of his reputation through mutual groups that we're both, belonging to. I really wanted to get his perspective on what do you think intellectual readiness was or is. And we became quick friends and had some really productive conversations. And so it was only sort of fitting that we could follow on that with the the article that we published here in this October proceedings.
Well, I'm so glad that you guys got to pair up for this, because I think it's just a terrific combination of your own intellects and also what you're your areas of expertise, and it comes out very nicely. Trent, your new book is about Chester W. Nimitz, the 5-star admiral, the commander of the Pacific Fleet in World War II. And this article talks about him quite a bit as well. Can you describe Nimitz's intellect and why it was so crucial to U.S. victory in World War II?
Yeah, I did want to relate Nimitz to this in sort of the opening anecdote. One of the things that was clear to me from the research and looking into the early days of Nimitz's assumption of command of the Pacific Fleet and then things that he tried to do in its early months, he's dealing with a challenge that sometimes doesn't quite make it into the histories or receive the attention that I think it deserves, and that is that. The attack on Pearl Harbor, the way in which the Japanese initiate the war, is a shock. It's a surprise on multiple levels. I mean, obviously, the Pacific Fleet, the heart of it, its battle line being destroyed in the attack is shocking in one way, but it's also shocking because no other Navy had brought together 6 fleet carriers like that. It created a force of naval aviation that had that kind of striking power. So the results of the attack are shocking. What the Japanese have done doctrinally is shocking. And then also it knocks officers of the Pacific Fleet back on their heels. They're not anticipating this for the reasons that I just spoke to, but at the same time, they have an assumption. They are accustomed to being the aggressor. This is what their training has inculcated within them. We will seize the initiative, we will act aggressively, and that is how we're going to control battles, it's how we're going to control operations, and it's how we'll take charge of the war when it eventually happens, should it occur. And Pearl Harbor shatters all that. And part of this is very deliberate. Like if you look back at Japanese thinking here, it's not just destroy ships, it's destroy the will of the United States Navy and its people to fight. Right, so that there can be essentially a fait accompli on the western side of the Pacific. And Nimitz is faced with that challenge. He's got to get beyond that. And so he displays, using the terms of our article, intellectual readiness and then tries to stimulate it within the officers in his command in the Pacific Fleet. Right, you've got to recover from this, and some officers aren't immediately ready to sort of ease back into or get right back into the kind of fighting that is going to be required. Others are more disposed to that. Vice Admiral Halsey, or at least he was Vice Admiral at the time, is in that mindset, and others are ready for that sort of thing. But Nimitz has to approach this cautiously. He has to use his ability not just to chart a path forward. This is, sort of the vision that I have for my command, but also understand where his subordinates are at that time. What are they capable of? What are they ready to do? What is their own intellectual readiness in that moment or in those early weeks? And amplify it where it is present, and then try to reinvigorate it where it is not. And so I thought that was a useful vignette to open the article with, that built on research that went into the book.
A follow-on question for you, Trent or Eric. Where did Nimitz get the intellectual basis, his own foundation, if you will, to be ready for that moment, to be ready for command of the Pacific Fleet at the moment after Pearl Harbor, when it was knocked back on its heels, and when it had been surprised strategically, operationally, tactically? And how did he himself, but also how did the Navy prepare him for that challenge?
I think I can talk to the Navy more broadly, more effectively. But let me just say initially with Nimitz, he displays a quiet confidence through much of his career that is really impressive. I'm sure many listeners know that he ran one of his early commands, a destroyer in the Philippines, ran it aground. And supposedly, when that happened, he got out a nice deck chair, something that had been made there locally in the Philippines, and sat on the forecastle and just sort of waited for the tide to come in, or waited for some assistance, because there wasn't anything else he or his crew could do at that moment. Right. So don't worry. Don't fret. Just wait until circumstances change and then take advantage of them when they do. That I have trouble with that story personally, because I don't think I could have been that calm. Absolutely not. You run your ship aground. Good grief, this is a problem. We have to fix it. We have to fix it now.
Right. Cause for panic.
Yeah. Closer to some kind of panic. But he didn't act that way. And so there was something about his personality from an early stage, right? Because that's when he's a very young officer, that allows him to find some inner calmness to deal with these in a way that I think very few of us can. But conditioning from a naval perspective, from the Navy, we tried to get into it in the article. I think there's a lot of work that goes on in the 20s and 30s, before that as well. But really, there's a system that is built up in the 20s and 30s to try to condition officers to think through challenging problems from multiple perspectives. There are many exercises. Some of these are at the Naval War College. Some of these are actually in the fleet. And maybe I shouldn't use the term exercises, because that connotes certain habits that we tried to talk to in the article. They're more like open-ended problems. Really confront an officer with a problem. There's no rote solution to follow. There's no checklist you can go through. There is a pattern that you can follow, to think about how you assess the situation that you are in, and then how to analyze it, and then how to frame plans and orders for subordinates. That is fairly well established. But in terms of the ingredients that you bring to that, what actually are you going to do? What options do you choose to analyze? What orders do you choose to craft your subordinates? That is all creative energy that those officers had to bring to the table at that time. And so Nimitz is accustomed to going through this, and many of his contemporaries are accustomed to going through this. You don't just follow rote procedures. You learn those. You learn those for the various departments that you go through, when you learn to command a ship or submarine or an aircraft. But figure out a lot of these things yourself. So he's accustomed to that. He was accustomed to thinking through those kinds of challenges. And I'll let Eric add to that, because it looks like he's been thinking of something.
Oh, I mean, always enjoyable to learn history. I would say I'm very much an amateur student of history. But I can say in reading about Nimitz, one thing that strikes me is, what would the equivalent, if he were to run a ship aground today, what would the equivalent response be? And I'm not a surface warfare officer, but I know plenty of SWOs, and I can pretty much guarantee you they would not be sitting on a deck chair relaxing and saying, don't worry about it, we'll take care of it. Not because it's not an emergency situation, but because that's essentially what you would consider a career-ending situation in today's Navy, for sure. Nimitz at the time, I believe, this is just Eric's opinion, but was very much a product of a time that was a little bit more accommodating for, coming up with new ideas and executing them, and maybe a little bit more appreciative of those things. There's kind of a common adage that we use that I think is appropriate here, which is, your ability to think is predicated on your perceived ability to act. And what that means is, in cognitive psychology terms, there's actually a way that you can limit people's creativity by artificially making them think that they have more constraints than they really do. So we can make this in a laboratory environment, and then we can observe how creative or not creative people are when they constrain themselves, when they believe they can only act within a certain way. Hopefully that's not too abstract. Hopefully that this is getting the point across. But there's a time when, if you can get the job done, even if it's not pretty, okay, you've gotten the job done, and hey, good job. You got the ship off of the shore, or whatever the situation is. Today, I would venture to say there's a lot more emphasis on, there's a specific right way. There's a checklist that you should follow. There's an established, this is the way. And that is itself kind of a cultural limiter to people's creativity. Your ability to think is directly associated to your perceived constraints. And if you're in an environment or you're in a culture or an organization that makes you feel like if you do anything outside of these boundaries, you're wrong, or you might be punished, or you're going to be interpreted as, say, insubordinate. Whereas maybe in Nimitz's time, that same action could be interpreted as creative or innovative. That has a big effect on people's abilities to think. And that's kind of a core point that we tried to drive home in this article. It is not that we lack intellectually ready people. There is no, and I'm going to be very definitive about this, there's no lack of intellect in today's United States Navy. There's no, we don't have enough trained individuals or enough talented or creative individuals. They are very much present in today's Navy. But many of the ways that we do business really constrains them. And in the event of a shock and surprise, not unlike Pearl Harbor, that's a very concerning concept. If they've been trained not to think and they've been trained to be afraid of trying new things, what happens when all the game rules change? And that's kind of the central core point to our article.
One of our most frequent listeners, Austere Roberto, brings up an example. He says, so the nuclear Navy has to be purely procedural, but how do you break those blinders in the tactical realm? And I was thinking while you were talking, Eric, I was thinking of my former co-host, Ward Carroll, who is an F-14 guy. And, when the F-14 gets into a flat spin, that's not the time to try to think creatively, right? There are very, very strict procedures to follow to get the airplane to do what you want it to do. And it's not to think about a pink sky at that moment, right? If I just want to tease out a little bit more, because the article also talks about some of the research and the interviews that you conducted with today's Navy leaders about training and education and about exercises. What are some of the key takeaways that came from your research and those interviews that you conducted as part of your research?
Well, you're absolutely right, and I appreciate our listeners' question here, because it is important to realize there are many reasons why we have established standard operating procedures, and there's at no time would I suggest that we should be creative at all times and throw out the book for everything. That's certainly not the case. There are absolutely plenty of lessons that we have learned the hard way, and we have actually come up with fairly stable heuristics or rubrics to follow, and there's very important times there. The types of things that Trent and I are trying to really focus on are, we've never seen this before. This is a move we've never practiced. This is a situation we never even anticipated. Those are the types where we have no standard operating procedures. And it's in those situations where we really need humans to do what humans do best, which is we have evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to creatively come up with new problem solving techniques and perceive new ways of doing things. And so it's in these unfamiliar one-off events that we've never trained for. That's really where intellectual readiness is a very critical thing, not in the type like a flat spin, to use your example, where we have seen this before. We understand how it happens. We also understand the physics of how to get out of it. And so here's what you need to do. That training is very important, but the type of training that we're talking about is much more, what is it you do when you don't know? So your question was, what did I learn from those interviews? Well, it's valuable to mention my study had two phases to it. The model building phase, which is what is a model of intellectual readiness? And by a model, I mean like a psychological model or organizational model. What are all the characteristics or attributes, personality, things like that make up this concept of intellectual readiness? Not just for individuals, not just to say like define like what is the perfect sailor, but also what is the organizational culture? What are the characteristics that an organization has to be able to be a learning organization and an adaptive organization? So to build that model, I took a multi-perspective approach. I did formal interviews with 3 different groups of people. I looked and talked to historians and folks who are experts in naval innovation history, and some sociologists who are experts in organizational culture and how it affects innovation and creativity from the historical perspective. So this is where Trent and I became good friends, because he was one of those historians that I reached out to and asked to participate. So I got that perspective, because it's important to realize this is not a new thing. I mean, if you think about it, the turn of the 20th century, aviation was an emerging technology. We were still just kind of figuring out not only how to fly reliably, but how can we use these new things, tactically and strategically. So we've been through this type of thing before. And I really want to make sure not to be ignorant of what we can learn from that perspective. Then I also talk to folks that are in the current Navy right now that are on the absolute bleeding edge of technology. So folks that are in experimental units like DDG-1000, the USS Michael Monsoor. It's a one-of-a-kind, brand new guided missile destroyer. It's a technological marvel. It's built in a completely different way than the Arleigh Burke class or any of the other classes of ships that we have. So talk to those folks on the Columbia-class submarine, folks that are working on the large and medium unmanned surface vessels, folks that are working on various different unmanned underwater vehicles, and not only just working on these that are still kind of in a prototype stage, but part of their job is figure out how we can use it. So they're kind of empowered in a way to be sort of an experimental unit, and coming up with strategies and tactics is part of what they're doing, which means they're doing a lot of fumbling around. They're doing a lot of stumbling and figuring things out, sometimes the hard way. So I talked to those folks and said, who works really well in this environment, and what do these technologies change? What do you need more of that you didn't have enough of? What kind of training would be necessary if this were to suddenly become a standard in the Navy and everyone were to get this, or every unit were to be, say, doing this now? So that's the current perspective. Then I also went to the far future. I went to Silicon Valley. I talked to folks at NVIDIA, Tesla. I spoke to the chief roboticist at NASA. I talked to folks at the Quantum Institute. I talked to all kinds of folks who are absolute experts in these really, really, really advanced technologies, many of which may not become mature even for another 20 years potentially. But it's important to get their perspective, because you got to start planning now. Organizationals don't change on a dime. So if you start making some small changes now, the sailors of tomorrow are just being born today. So those 3 perspectives, those interviews helped me to build out the model of intellectual readiness. And then from there, I validated that model, which was another sort of phase of that. During those interviews, the most important thing was I started with this idea to say, essentially, I was thinking my job was to define the perfect sailor of the 21st century. Very quickly, within the first month of these interviews, and I did this for 7 months straight, a total of 49 people, over 114 hours of transcripts that I had. Within the first month, it became very evident to me exactly what I said earlier, which is we don't lack intellectually ready people today. They're all around us. In fact, I was speaking to many of them firsthand on satellite phones, on folks who were floating around in the South China Sea right here and right now. Really quickly, I saw the bigger issue, the more salient issue, the more pressing and immediate issue is the way that our organization itself, the way that we've set up our rules and our practices, the way that we teach people, all of those things are actually acting as constraints. Those things are actually causing us more problems, sometimes unknowingly. And that is the real pernicious issue that I discovered through these interviews. So really quickly, it became no longer just what is like Seaman Jimmy. How do we get more Seaman Jimmys, the perfect seaman, but how do we get an organization that allows people like Seaman Jimmy and Captain James and whatever else to really thrive and be able to respond when we need them to.
So we got another question from one of our listeners, Harry Lime. He asked, does the Navy still do fleet problems like you read about from the 1930s to test out new technology and how to use them? And I know, Trent, you talk about the fleet problems a lot in your book, Learning War. And there's reference to that, and that the process of learning and applying and, studying and wargaming and then doing the fleet problems in the 30s and the lead up. So I'll throw that question to you to start.
Sure. There has been interest in reinvigorating this kind of concept lately. I know there have been some large exercises, especially out in the Pacific. But I think in general, the approach that the Navy is taking today is not as comprehensive as what it did in the interwar period, the 1920s and the 1930s. There are a couple different reasons for that. Of course, at that time, the Navy was able to hold most of its ships close to or near the continental United States. So fleet problems could be large. They would be sort of the large operational event every year. And there weren't so many forces that were forward deployed, places like the Middle East or the Western Pacific. And so it was relatively straightforward to do that, to bring a large element of the fleet together, to practice, to rehearse, and also to experiment and explore these capabilities and new technologies. Given the constraints that the Navy faces today, the fact that ships have to be on station much more often, farther out from the United States and its shores, the Navy is trying alternative mechanisms to figure out how best to do these kinds of experiments. Right? There are groups that Eric talked about that are learning how to do the best with new technologies, whether they be shipboard or at sea, like unmanned vehicles above, on, and below the surface of the sea. And I think some of that is having some very fruitful learning. What I am uncertain about is it as comprehensive or extensive as some of the open-ended exercises that were able to be conducted before World War II? And that is something that we wanted to address in the article. And it gets back to the point that Eric was just making, which is that the environment today is more constraining, best as we can perceive. And it feels like there aren't as many options when some of these exercises or problems are engaged in. That is, the approaches are more rote, evaluated more in terms of how closely do they conform to best practices, rather than how well do they identify new approaches that may be unlocking a specific capability or allowing us to maximize the benefits of a particular technology. And that is a challenge. That is a challenge that I think needs to be addressed. So there's challenges within terms of how to organize all this, which I spoke to at the beginning. Constraints today that didn't exist then, but also I think there is a different attitude toward how these are conducted and evaluated, and that I think is probably a more substantial issue. And one of the things that we tried to do in the article was provide some recommendations for things that the Navy could do to get beyond some of the challenges that we believe it faces in the current moment.
That's a great point. And for our listeners, if you go back to early 2018, there was a series of 3 articles by Admiral Scott Swift when he was the Pacific Fleet Commander. One of them was about specifically about fleet battle problems that he was bringing back at the time, and looking for ways to do more creative exercises at sea, specifically with forces as they deployed from the West Coast towards Hawaii, and using an OPFOR and using some virtual and constructive as well. So when I was out at Tailhook a few weeks ago out in Fallon, Nevada, there was a big conversation about LVC, live, virtual, and constructive, and things that they could do, particularly around 5th generation threats at the Fallon Range Complex. And there's certain things that you don't want to show tactically in the real world to your adversaries. The Chinese have got overhead satellites, constellations of ISR capabilities, et cetera. So some of those capabilities you might want to only do virtually or constructively. But that whole, how do you do that? How do you do the fleet problems of the 1930s in the 2020s? with the new technology, with the 5th gen and 6th gen weapons, with cyber capabilities, and with electric weapons. It gets really complicated really fast. But your article really points out very well that it's important to be able to have those open-ended problems, right? Where you don't have the textbook solution, and where maybe the individual unit level CEOs or the carrier strike group CEOs, commanders, have the ability to learn from mistakes. Not just hey, you got to go out and here's the gouge answer, but well, we went out, we tried this is why we tried it, and it failed. Okay, so what do we learn from that, right? That learning, I think that was a big part of, Trent, if I remember your book correctly, a lot of the learning that happened for Nimitz and his generation was the ability to make mistakes and to learn from those mistakes in the fleet problems of the 1930s. So really critical point there. I want to just, we're running a little bit short on time here, so I want to get to some of the recommendations from your article. So there's two different categories that you gentlemen make. One is recommendations for individuals, and the second is recommendations for organizations. So I'm not sure which one of you wrote which section there, if you collaborated, but who wants to take the the recommendations for individuals?
Well, I'll jump in on that one, I suppose, only because that's somewhat of the follow-on work that I've continued to do. I've received funding to do, to take this study and continue on with it. And a lot of the work that needs to be done now is really the sort of the nitty-gritty kind of work. Like, okay, well, let's, for instance, the model of intellectual readiness that I developed was a 12-factor model, which means there's 12 individual characteristics or traits or attributes that we are interested in. So let's take one like FAR transfer learning. FAR transfer learning is this concept where you learn the fundamentals of a thing in one domain, and somehow if you're able to take concepts from that domain and then apply them and use them in a completely different domain. And the farther these domains are from each other, that's why you call it FAR transfer. And that is very, very, very important in a number of ways to this concept of intellectual readiness. So how do you train someone to do that? That is an open-ended research question. So the Navy can't necessarily just say, okay, well, here's a new curriculum. Every single person needs to use it. So we have to figure out, well, how do you actually develop those types of traits? And a lot of it has to do with the nitty-gritty stuff, like how do you promote active learning and not just passive learning? How do you create training that's not just teaching someone how to pass a test, but actually teaching them how to think? And a lot of that comes down to, similar to what we were just discussing in our like naval exercises. I think a favorite that everyone likes to bring up is from Star Trek, the concept of like a Kobayashi Maru, which is this sort of open-ended, you can't necessarily win, although not everybody's aware of that before you watch Star Trek. But it tests your ability to respond and think creatively and use your resources intelligently while you're encountering really fast-paced uncertainty and things like that. That's the kind of like training that would actually take quite a big paradigm shift, because right now, quite frankly, we teach to the test, and it's not necessarily, our training is currently not necessarily something that promotes something like FAR transfer learning, as an example. So for the individual, these are the types of things that now a lot of other experts have to come in and help build out the tests themselves, make recommendations by, say, rating or designator. So different officer communities or different enlisted communities have different trainings. You've got to build those kind of trainings out, test for their efficacy, make sure that you're actually training them in the ways that are, helpful. And those are like really important. And that's an ongoing process. There's nothing like glaringly, we need to, like, this ship is sinking right now. Training is constantly being updated and validated and things like that. But training right now does not prioritize the types of characteristics that we're generally talking about. And that's the kind of recommendation, broadly recommendation, that we would really think would be very advantageous for us moving forward.
Trent, do you want to tackle the recommendations your article makes for the organization, the organizational level Navy?
Sure. I can spend some time on one that I feel very passionately about, because it's something that often comes out of conversations that I have with currently serving naval officers, and that's the importance of embracing adaptability, resiliency, creativity. We've talked a lot about creativity, open-ended problem solving. The problem is that many ways in which the Navy evaluates officers and itself today is through the window or the lens of efficiency, right? And when we are trying to make things as efficient as possible, we are optimizing a certain approach to things. We're optimizing for, no fat, no resiliency, no redundancy, right? And what that then carries with it is this assumption that we're going to be able to devise a plan, stick to the plan, and then that's how we're gonna manage and we're gonna run it. The problem is, life in general, we know unanticipated things come up. Well, that's going to be even worse if there is a move toward an actual conflict or a near conflict situation. And so you need more slack in the system to be able to ensure that there is room to flex and adapt and adjust and have resilient approaches, more fault tolerant approaches that can deal with the uncertainty or the unanticipated events that come up. And this could be as simple as, how do you plan for, yard time, when a ship has to go in and get refurbished. You're going to encounter things that weren't part of that plan initially. So how do you get a head start on identifying those things? How do you make sure that you're accounting for those things? How can you adapt and adjust and have some slack in terms of the inventory that you have ready to deal with the kinds of work that ship is going to need while it is in and being overhauled? Resiliency there is necessary. It's even more necessary when we think about operational constraints and how that is going to have to happen. So this emphasis on efficiency at the organizational level is problematic. That doesn't mean that we should be, wasteful of the nation's resources. It's just there has to be the appropriate balance between efficiency and between this ability to adapt and adjust and be resilient when the unanticipated things come up and occur. Something else that we recommended that I want to say in the end is provide some more serious training or familiarization for how officers and other senior staff members can deal with innovation and innovators, how they can manage these kinds of processes. One of the things that came out that we wanted to recommend was that sometimes the tools that currently serving officers are equipped with aren't disposing them well to deal with the kinds of work that's necessary to wrestle with the new technology and to make it feasible and to bring it to fruition, right? There's a lot of uncertainty that goes along with that. There's a lot of false starts that come with that. You have to really be thinking about, options, the future that you want to try to achieve, but not be linear in terms of your approach of how you get there. And we feel that officers could get more familiarization with how this can be done and encouraged, so that we've got an environment that can foster creativity, foster innovation, and foster more inventive use of the technologies that are available out there, both within the service, but also the public sphere. And so that's something else that I think is quite valuable and important.
Yeah, those are terrific points. And I think back to, particularly during OIF and OEF, the Navy was supplying a product, which was carrier strike groups to, CENTCOM, to the Middle East. And, to your point about leaning out and about making things as efficient as possible from that period of really the 2010s, the 2000s and 2010s, where we were leaning out and building carrier strike group readiness to deploy to to the Persian Gulf area, and then come back and then get ready. And there was it was very flowcharty. It was very, and I think the lesson that you just pointed out is one that's, the world is learning right now. You think about supply chain managers, you think about the assumptions that were made about, lean manufacturing, and we're just going to offshore these things to the most efficient and cheapest place to manufacture them. But that didn't take into account a whole lot of things that have now happened in terms of how goods move around the world, around energy supply, all kinds of things, right? So that ability, the companies that thrived were the ones that probably had a little bit more resiliency built in or baked in. And I think that point about resiliency is incredibly important for the military, for the Navy right now. So as we wrap up, parting shots, any last minute, by the way, saved rounds that you might have?
I certainly do. I would say the single largest, say, point that I always try to make is top down is not the only way. Our military historically has always been a very vertical organization. And it's the same with the way that we approach innovation. Ideas come from above. They're expected from the people at the very top. They follow one direction. You sort of follow your marching orders, and the process is all built from a top-down structure. The problem is we have very intelligent people, increasingly technologically savvy people. I interviewed someone who had a computer science degree from Stanford, the top computer science program in the entire country. And he's a lieutenant junior grade assistant fire watch officer on a DDG. So we have an increasingly technologically savvy junior population of leaders who can look at our system and say, you know what, there's a lot of inefficiencies here. Or look at our system and say, wow, we actually could do something completely radically different if you just let me do it. And that's a bottom-up approach. We have to be able to accommodate ideas from somewhere other than a 4-star or nothing else at all, or a TICOM or some very high organization. Our current acquisition strategy is just only top-down only, and that's where you really are limiting intellectual readiness. We've got to be able to do it a little bit of both. And if we could just change one thing, that would be it, is somehow make our whole entire system more accepting, embracing the idea of change and letting those ideas come up and letting them blossom and grow and promoting them up, rather than what happens a lot is we have this cadre of people who see it as their goal to keep things as they are. And so they kind of they see themselves as gatekeepers of ideas rather than facilitators of ideas. And that's to me the single largest threat to intellectual readiness.
It's a salient point. Thank you, Eric. Trent, real quick.
Yeah, to augment that a bit, I think, there has to be a bottom up. That is one of the things that the Navy did well in the first half of the 20th century, was encouraging bottom up ideas. We highlighted some aspects in the article. One of the things that sits in the back of my head is the thatch weave, which was used by Grumman F-4F pilots against Japanese fighter planes. Right, that is a bottom up idea, and it is spurred by this. Oh, gee, here's a situation we didn't consider before, but it is enabled by the procedures that they had become conversant at, namely, high angle deflection shooting, the ability to hit a target that is moving rapidly across your line of sight. There's network also, right? Innovation, creative ideas often happen through a network, a connection of individuals. And I think our article is a great example of that, right? Eric found me through a network. We got to talking. Ideas flourished. Boom. We have an article. It's part of the Sea Power series. It's in proceedings. And now we're talking about it on a podcast, because one of the things that I keep in my head is the value of establishing these kinds of connections to bring new ideas into my own sphere, and then also, use those for the benefits of the people that I engage with. I think the Navy needs to be mindful of that, right? It can't be top down. It can't just be bottom up. There's got to be networks Networks of learning in the operating theaters were a key aspect of introducing new approaches like the Combat Information Center and other innovative things that the Navy came up with in the Second World War. So finding a way to do that now before it is absolutely necessary is going to be great, because then it can be called on when it is necessary. So that's the point that I'd leave us with.
Key points. Those are really great way to put an exclamation mark at the end of this interview. So Trent Hone and Eric Vorm, thank you so much for your article. Thanks for contributing to the American Sea Power Project. And thanks for being on the show today. This was just a terrific conversation. Well, that wraps up another episode of the Proceedings podcast, brought to you by the members of the Naval Institute and produced by Heather Legg. If you enjoy the show, like us, subscribe to our channel, tell your friends, become a member of the Naval Institute at usni.org/join. And until next episode, remember, victory begins at the Naval Institute.